subpages. So at the most basic level, a subpage is really just a page, another page that's set up in the same way. It's got the same sort of components to it. So for a quick example, well, looking at this, you can see there are a lot of subpages tied to the Stens shell. So now getting back to the performance issue we talked about before. Looking here, okay, well, there's no store procedure attached to this shell. But if you look at the subpages, a lot of these, who knows how many of them, probably most of them, have store procedures attached to them. And these will be executed every time the page is loaded. Well, there is the ability to use caching to kind of reduce that, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Assuming you don't have the page cached, every time the page is loaded, all of these subpages need to be loaded as well. All the store procedures that run behind them need to be executed. And if they're slow, you're going to find that's going to impact you anywhere on the site. A good way to test that would be just to create, blank page, a very basic page, a static content page, and see what the performance is like there. You're not doing anything on the page itself. You're just basically loading the shell and sticking a small amount of, static content into it. If that runs quickly, then you can be fairly confident you've done a good job with your subpages and with the shell. If it runs slowly, then you've got a problem. So, and just before I go any further, I'll show you how you can do that. Anytime you find a page, if you want to create a new page, there's a number of different ways to do it. The simplest way is in all content. You just click on this button here. Your interface changes. You select the content type. You can make the status inactive if you want to make it temporarily unavailable. Give it a name. Primary type and secondary type will generally be blank except under specific circumstances, which I'm not going to get into right now. And you want to say create HTML so you can create a new HTML template for this page. Unless you know that you're going to use one that's already existing. So if you're going to use something that you want to have use this search results template, then you could say, no, don't create new HTML. Just create me the page, and then I'll add the search results HTML to it. That being said, there's an easier way to do it. So if you wanted to, let's say, make a different type of search page, basically does the same thing, but maybe you got some new kind of layout for it. Maybe you want to change the menus around. Maybe you want one that uses a different shell. You can just go in here, click on the page, and then click on this copy button right here. Make sure not to click on delete. And what this does is this makes a new copy of it. You can pick which site to copy to if you have a multi-site project. Give it a new name, and then you have 3 options here. Now these are very important, so be careful what you pick because they have very significant changes in behavior depending on what you do. So linked pages and primary links, these basically say, okay, do you want your new page to be linked to the same content that this page is? So linked pages is for things like subpages, for example. If you know that you want to copy the search results page, you still want all the brand and category and spec drop-downs associated with it, you're going to want to say yes to that. Primary links is for things like, I showed you how content can be linked to other content. For example, if you have a category with a bunch of products in it, you want to copy that category. Or maybe a better example in the Stems case is you have a, at one point you had your specials pages where you just were linking products to a general page, and you just want to make sure they showed up and people knew that these were special or these were being discounted right now. Those come under primary links. If you say yes, you'll copy them. If you say no, you won't. And then HTML template. This is probably the most important one and one that I see people confused by most often. If you say no, that doesn't mean you won't have HTML available. What it means is this will use the same template as the thing you're copying, same exact template. So if you were to copy this search results page, For HTML template, you're going to say yes. You're going to say no. That means your new page will be either way, no or yes, your new page is going to be a copy of this one. But if you say no and then you go change some of the HTML in the new page, now that change is going to be reflected on both of them. So you've changed your copy. Maybe without meaning to, you've also changed the original. However, if you say yes, it will create a new HTML template, a copy of the old one. You can do whatever you want to that one, and it won't have any impact on your source. So for all three of these, there's no real standard for which one you're going to want to do most of the time. It's all very dependent on what your specific needs are, what exactly you're trying to do, and you need to think carefully about it every time you make a copy. Just one more thing to add to this. Some of the things that we're talking about in training, if you have more questions, you want to dig into it a little further, maybe you want to try something out yourself, this is probably the best way to do that. So, let's say some of the things we were talking about, the search results page here, you want to see if you can change that behavior, you want to see if you can move things around, what's going to happen, but you don't want to mess with the existing search page, even on dev. It's not going to affect any real users right away, but it could cause a lot of problems when we're trying to develop for the real live site. So what you could do is just make a copy of it, maybe add a name, something to the name so you know that it's a text, and then you can go to that new copy, you can do whatever you want to it, and you know that you're not going to cause any impact on the real site. Okay, so now that we've covered that aside, we'll go back and start talking about subpages again. So all of these different subpages are part of the default shell. So that's why, even though the shell has no entities tied to it, we get a lot of behavior, a lot of advanced behavior, which obviously needs to interact with the database. For example, order, search, add to cart, the fast order entry, these menus, which are displayed differently depending on whether you're logged in or who you are when you're logged in. For example, under My Links, because I have full access, I get 5 links here. Regular user might only see file library. So the shell can just be basically plain HTML, a little bit of, with no real advanced functionality, but can actually have a lot of functionality attached to it because of the ability to include subpages. So the fast order is a good one to look at. And you can see now, when we're looking at the fast order page, that it is basically the same as a regular page. In theory, you could go into the console, go into the portal and just load this page on its own. Because it's not designed to work on its own, it's not going to be functional, and it's not going to look proper. But that capability is there. And as you can see, you look at the Sites tab, you're seeing the exact same type of data that we saw in the Sites tab for the shell, or that we saw in the Sites tab for the search results. So again, going back to when we were talking about webhook content, you can see where these advantages, the advantage of treating everything as content, how they're coming through now. We have one sort of standard approach for making changes to most of the pages on the site, most of the functionality, most of the different pieces you plug in. It's all done the same way. And it also gives you the ability, if you wanted, you could have something that functions both as a standalone page or as something that plugs into another page. You can see here, well, I'll just show you what this looks like if we were just to plug it into the portal. So obviously you can see it's not really meant to go there, but it will show up and it'll have the stems shell around it. However, it's important to note that if this is included as a sub-page somewhere else, we don't load the shell again. The shell is only used if you're loading the page directly. So you can include the default shell here without worrying that it's going to add additional workload or maybe get you into an endless loop where every time you load the shell, you're loading the fast order page and then loading the shell again and loading the fast order page and so on. Everything else on this, like I said, it gets edited the same way as a regular page. You've got your body, you've got your row templates. Oh, actually, that's one thing I did want to mention. You can see here in the row, we've got this replacement value here, exclamation mark R, exclamation mark. That's one of the standard value that comes back from Webfoot. It's only available on the row template, and it's basically just a number. Starting from 1 and going up in sequence, every new row, the number increases. And you can use this to differentiate one row from another one. So for example, on the fast order page, let's just go and show it in the real interface. We want to know that this quantity and this part number are linked together. Quantity 1 and part number 1. Quantity 2 is linked to part number 2, and so on. We can just use this R keyword to manage that relationship. But as you can see, you include the HTML here. You can include JavaScript. You can include anything you want. You go to web page additions. You can add links that go in the header. And any page that loads this subpage will also take whatever's here and stick it into the head section of the HTML that's eventually returned to the user. Two other things to mention with the subpage before we move on is to add that subpage to the shell or to any other page. You'll click on this subpages link, and then you can see a list of all the subpages, and you just check that page to make sure it appears. However, this is not all you need to do. You also need to determine where on the page, where in the HTML does this subpage show up. And you do that by using this field here, HTML replacement. So this is how you determine the keyword for this for the HTML that gets returned here. And I'll illustrate that by showing you. In this case, our HTML replacement, the fast order, is set to, we're using an HTML comment here, and we're putting in sub:" fast order. If we look at the HTML for the default shell, we search for fast order. Hold on, Chrome's not really cooperating too well. Let's say, okay, I'll just copy this out. So you can see the HTML here. Actually, this is an example of something I can show you later, where the subpage is actually included in another subpage. So here, the fast order page is actually included in this entire section here, which is a different subpage. It is the search bar. So we look inside the HTML for the search bar, and here we find sub:"fast order. So this shows you that there's a number of different ways to get the same thing. In our case, we attach the subpage to the default shell, not to the search bar. We could attach to the search bar and get this information and get the same result. So even though we attach the subpage directly to the default shell, that HTML comes back. It's available through this replacement value, and now you can include that anywhere in the main HTML for the shell, as well as in the HTML for anything else attached to it, whether it be another subpage, whether it be the main page you're looking at. Anything that will be returned by C#, anything sent back to the user, you have the capability of taking this keyword replacement and sticking it in there, and the HTML will appear where you want it. So that brings up an important point, is that just adding it to your subpages list won't get it to show up. You need to take that replacement value and put it in the HTML somewhere. And this is something that sometimes gets missed, during rapid development or when people are trying different things and maybe changing things around, is the subpage might get removed from the HTML, so it doesn't show up anymore, but then you forget to remove the link to the subpage in the content. And what will happen there is because it's linked to the shell, in this case, the store procedure behind the fast order will get loaded. So it will be executed, but will do the work required to bring back that data, send it back to C#, but we won't have anywhere to actually put it. So that's just a waste of resources that has no benefit. So be very careful when you are developing to always manage that relationship. If you are removing an HTML a replacement, you're removing a subpage from the HTML, come back here and be sure to remove it from the actual link as well. One last thing to show you on the subpages is when you edit them, you'll see that you have a few different options here. The main one I want to point out right now is the sort. And this is particularly important on the subpages for our search results. In this case, we've got the 3 different methods of refining your search: brand, category, and spec. But what we're doing here is we're executing the store procedure to bring back the search results on the main page. Main page will execute before the subpage. So we do that first. We enter those results into a temporary table. That's not actually a temporary table. It's a real full-on table in a database that is used to temporarily store data. So it's a staging table, I guess you could call it. When we're picking out the brands that you might want to filter by, the categories, the specs, we need to know what search results are brought back here. So we stick that information in the staging table. Each of these subpages reads out of that, so it can tell you, it can execute its logic to get the specs, for example, it needs to show you. And then at the end of that process, we want to delete what we just entered into that staging table so that we don't clutter it up. The table doesn't grow to an unmanageable size. We just keep it nice and lean. If you don't order your subpages correctly, and this is something that actually happened earlier when we were in development, and we had to just spend some time investigating and fix it, then that delete could come at the wrong time. So for example, this used to be in a different order. I believe specs was first and brand was last, or something like that. So we were doing the delete as part of the brand, let's say. Well, that meant that we could, by the time the specs subpage was executing, that data was no longer in, that staging table, the data it needed to display this information. So we need to manage the order of the subpages to ensure that they're executing in the order you want, and anything that's going to have an effect on other functionality on that same page is done in the correct order. It doesn't actually matter which way, what order they're displayed in on the page. You can load them in whatever order you want and then put the replacements anywhere on the page you need them. But subpages have to be executed. The code has to be executed in the right order, or you could run into problems. So you can see that, well, in this case, we haven't actually set it yet. And I think it was actually the model search where we did that, but either way, that's a problem that can come up. Other things you can do on here is determine whether or not to cache that subpage. So, but I'll talk about caching later. So again, as I mentioned, you can embed subpages inside other pages, other subpages. to n levels as much as you want, and you just use this HTML replacement to determine where that should show up. Now, this HTML replacement can be anything you want. It can be any format. You don't have to use this standard, although I would recommend you do for a couple of reasons. First of all, it just makes it clear that this is a subpage as opposed to potentially a menu or a catalog, something like that. The other thing is that by using the standard HTML comment format, you ensure that if you want to do, take your raw template, HTML template, and test to see if it's valid HTML, that you don't get a failure because of some weird format you might have picked. So for example, you could, if you wanted, just use an HTML replacement like that. Webfoot will allow it, but then what you have in the actual HTML here would no longer be valid markup.